Good afternoon and welcome to our series 2021 Philosophers, dedicated to the reinvention of philosophy and philosophical practices in French. My guest today is Laurent de Sutter, a young philosopher from Belgium, a professor of legal theory at Vrij Universiteit Brussels. And he has been visiting researcher in several universities all over the world. Laurent has an extraordinary energy for thinking. He writes an average of 3 books a year. It means more than 20 books translated into a dozen languages, from his first Pornostar Fragment d'une métaphysique du X in 2007 to his most recent one, released just a few days ago, Hors la loi, théorie de l'anarchie juridique, Outlaw, a theory of juridical anarchy. I quote, a small manifesto for the renewal of juridical militancy in the hyper-legal age, as well as a frontal attack upon the absurd category of legal certainty. Laurent is very involved in the contemporary philosophical scene, and I'm very happy to welcome him, not only for his own work as a philosopher, but also for his public activities. He is the editor of the Theory Redux series at Polity Press and the Perspective Critique series at the Presse Universitaire de France. Laurent is also very active as a media figure with regular columns in both weekly magazines and radio broadcasts. He will give a 30-40 minute presentation, and at the end of his speech, he will answer your questions, and you can already ask them through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. This lecture is being recorded, and you can watch it again on our YouTube channel. Laurent, welcome to La Maison Française.
Thank you very much for your invitation, François. I'm delighted.
So, we are listening to you. We are listening to you.
Okay. It has been it's my privilege to have the opportunity to put about my I wouldn't say my output, because it would sound a little bit too too productivist, but let's say the type of relationship that I have with thought and philosophy, especially in French language, and yes, I consider a privilege to be part of this very remarkable series, and to be able to discuss with you, despite the time change and geographical distance. I wouldn't say thank coronavirus, because that wouldn't be appropriate at all, but still, it's somehow working. It's quite hard to introduce oneself. It's always hard to introduce oneself to an audience that is hypothetically not familiar with one's work. And if I may say so, it's even harder for me, since, as François Nudelman has so very kindly reminded us, I publish a lot. And there is not that much translated into English, to be fair. Only 2 books on among the 20 plus that I've published to this day. And it's especially hard for me because precisely the book as a vehicle of thought is something which is very important to me in my life, but also very important to me theoretically speaking. I mean, the book for me is a theoretical object that I try to theorize, so to speak, in my work, and that I try also to theorize as a practice as a publisher, as well as an author. Because to put it very, very simply, I don't think that thought, ideas, concepts, or philosophy exists outside of the form that gives its existence, and outside of the media that provide the room for this existence to actually unfold. So I don't believe that there are ideas in our head waiting for us to be expressed, or I don't believe either that there's some kind of a functioning of a brain that would, let's say, lead automatically if we concentrate enough on ideas, on discoveries, on theories, and even on systems. I don't believe it. I don't believe it, or rather, don't want to believe it. I mean, it's almost an article of faith, because I have this, maybe this intuition of, or this feeling that in any theory about the production of ideas that focuses on the, let's say, automatic brain activity that is ours, or on let's say the platonic horizon of ideas that would exist out there for us to grab, we miss a very important dimension. And this dimension is the dimension of the laboratory, the dimension of the lab, the dimension of the experimentation. The fact that when we start to talk, actually, we don't know what we are talking about, like I'm doing it right now, and that we need some device, some constraint for this stream of thought to actually start to get an existence, and to get a form that will lead the flow of ideas outside of its starting point and into some new realms, or realms that were not foreseen necessarily. That's why the book is so important to me. I take the book as really that, as a laboratory, as an experimental device that forces me to think outside of what I could be thinking as a primary intuition, force me to write down ideas that then unfold throughout the writing, and throughout the constraint also that I put on my writing, to be fair, because I have this very obsessive way of writing, when I actually make calculations in such a way that all my my paragraphs and even my sentences are actually of the same length, and everything is created and conceived in the form of precisely a volume or multidimensional objects that then takes the form of a book in the end. But that's, let's say, that's almost private business. But what matters really for me is that this dimension of the media and of the medium, so the medium also in terms almost psychic, that the book takes, is for me the ecology, or the natural ecology of thought, or at least the natural ecology of my thought. And perhaps my curse in that respect is the fact that I write quite a lot of books, but these are very small books. And this is, of course, a problem, because for strange reasons that are both historical, sociological, but also economical, and linked to the evolution of English and American academia, well, English language doesn't like small books. There's this idea that still is out there, that a book must represent something like, I don't know, the achievement of a form of work, of which it would present a almost conclusive form. I would say a closed system or a final system, but let's say a quite comprehensive landscape that would act as a testimony of a true input, or big amount of work having been put into a given topic. I take the book as something quite different than that, not as the end result of a research, but because of this experimental dimension that I was talking about, as a starting point for something different, meaning that my books never show or provide or showcase conclusions or final hypotheses, but only proposals, to put it like that, and proposals that always take the form of some sort of a what if, an hypothetical or even fictional hypothesis that is put within a given sphere, given realm, about a very specific topic, a topic that I don't claim to master, that I don't claim to be competent about or even skilled about, but simply I'm in a meeting with a given topic or a given object, say prostitution or pornography, say the politics and economy of drugs in late capitalism, or say the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, all kinds of objects of this sort. In the encounter with these objects, the only one thing that I'm capable of doing is to ask the question, knowing what I know from the mere encounter with it, what if first it could be different than what it seems, and what if this difference, I could make it appear so, or I could follow it in such a way that it would also really make a difference in terms of thoughts. And that's my bet every time that I start to work on a given topic. It's really a bet in terms of the type of consequences that the exercise of thought, seen as an experimental, almost a test, as the putting myself into trial in the encounter with a given topic, could lead us not only for the understanding of the topic at stake, but also for the very functioning of thought itself. And I will just give you 2 examples because of the 2 books translated into English. The first one is called Narco-Capitalism, and the subtitle is Life in the Age of Anesthesia. And it's a book about the recent history of what has happened to the treatment of the body and the mind since the invention of the first anesthetics at the very, in the first half of the 19th century. And how, since the invention of the very first anesthetics to I don't know, daily, consumption of antidepressant or sleeping pills or even recreative drugs, there is a whole history of political concerns and theoretical concerns around a very specific category that goes through, let's say, this entire history from precisely the invention of the anesthetics, throughout the invention of the category of the manic depressive at the end of the 19th century, to the invention of the category of the crowd, also in the same period, parallel with the invention of sociology and criminology, which is precisely the fear caused by what was called by the first sociologists, the first criminologists, the psychiatrists of the time, but also the specialists in surgery and the medical doctors, namely excitation. And maybe excitation or excitement. In French, there's only one word for that. But let's say the excitement, meaning the fact that the body reacts always in a way that goes outside let's say the well-normed boundaries to explore fields that could cause problems. And it's the case, of course, of the surgeons who have to perform their surgery upon bodies that before the invention of anesthetics reacted in a very violent way and in such a way that they would endanger the success of or jeopardize the success of the surgical operations themselves. So the anesthetics allowed for suddenly the possibility to deal with bodies that were simply bodies, dead bodies, so to speak, bodies that would simply be matter and passive matter that you could operate upon. Well, it's the same with the invention of the category of manic depressive by the important Prussian, let's say, psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin at the end of the 19th century, where he was also afraid of the excitation, not of the body this time, but the excitation that could contaminate his hospital. He was director of a very important psychiatric hospital. Within his hospital, he was afraid that in case of one of his patients suddenly entering into some kind of a manic frenzy or manic phase in his or her manic depression, it would lead others to follow in the steps and then to to transform his hospital into a gigantic mess. And this idea of the excitation through the psychic functioning of the manic depression category that he had invented was this big fear. He was afraid of excitation, the same as sociologists and criminologists were afraid of when they created this new entity that was not existing theoretically, at least before, the category of the mass of or of the crowd. They was also afraid of the excitability, of the fact that the crowd could be excited in such a way that they would transform the individuals, by way of hypothesis, an individual being always capable of somehow of controlling him or herself, into someone closer to an animal than a human being. And the word was always that: excitation, excitation, excitation. And I wanted simply to build a very fast and rapid and let's say maybe a little bit wild or preposterous even, I don't know, genealogy of this idea of excitation, how it run through different fields. And it run through different fields in such a way that it would lead to a conclusion about not simply psychiatric control of the mind or the surgical control of the bodies or the political control of the crowds or the masses, but really to a questioning to the very idea of being, because the concept of excitation, when it appears, always appears in relationship to a claim about what is to be human. What is the type of being that is at the core of humanity that excitation leads us always away from. And again, the psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin was the one who expressed it the best in his very classic and very important at the time manual of psychiatry, where he described for the first time the manic depressive psychosis, as he called it, was precisely that with excitation, something would happen with his patients. And what would happen was that in German, that the word he used was irre sein, erring, the erring of being, the fact that beings would start to wander around, to walk away from their own body or their own limits, the limits that would actually be the limits of depression. If manic, the mania is the moment where there is this irre sein, this erring of being, of course, the being that would not err would, of course, be the being of the depressive, the one, expelled from his or her mania. And there's a claim like that in that circulates throughout the last century and a half of fight and or suspicion towards excitation, which is a claim about being as a category that always to be fully acknowledged, for a being to be fully acknowledged as a being, it's only possible because there are limits. So being is only possible because of the limits of being, so to speak. Making being a category that is not simply a descriptive category or a category inherited from Western metaphysics with all the problems that goes with it, and that people like Derrida and all the others have perfectly pointed out and shown, but really a positive category, which is the category of police. The being as a category of police was, if you want, the object or the end result of my little experimentation with psychiatric phenomena, with drugs, and so on and so forth in this little book, in this little narco-capitalism book. So if you see, there's these two dimensions, something that I try to say about the objects, this thing, the anesthetics, what do they do, where do they lead us, why these substances permeate throughout the period, why Kraepelin was one of the first one to use chlorohydrate to sedate his patients, chlorohydrate, which is a direct, it's not a derivative, I don't find a word now, it's direct byproducts of the first, of course, anesthetics, and then up to, of course, drugs like cocaine, for instance, which, of course, is an anesthetic and was used first as an anesthetic, local anesthetics in optical and dental operations, up to the antidepressant of our age. There is a whole genealogy, also chemical genealogy, if you like, that goes with this genealogy of the fight against excitation, and this genealogy then in the end of the category of being as something, as a category of police that I wanted to let's say to outline, or at least to suggest, because this is something that maybe I've not insisted enough upon. I don't think that by saying that I'm not trying to add a new chapter in the critique of modernity, or in the critique of psychiatry, or in the critique of the history of chemistry, for instance. What I'm trying to do is simply to open up a door to formulate a proposal apropos or about being itself, so to speak, about this category and about the category of excitation. And here the proposal would be, what if the category of excitation was precisely the one that we should save now, rather than adding on the endless layer of critique? Couldn't we invent, if I can use here a distinction by Gilles Deleuze, the distinction precisely between critique and clinique, why can't we open up in this specific field, and then for thought, the possibility of a clinique of excitation against the mere critique of being that would be our first reflex as post-structuralists raised into a critical thinking and so on and so forth. So the idea of a proposal here, for me, is a way to try to fictionalize and to open up some form of fiction or fabulation about another way of seeing the world and another way of acting into the world that would recuperate and save somehow a lost category and transform it into something that would still that would help us explore possibilities that its relegation had rendered impossible before. So that's an example, if you like. The other example, which is maybe a different example because it's maybe the only not small book that I've written in my output, which is After Law, and maybe that's one of the reasons. Maybe that's why one of the reasons why it has actually been translated, because maybe it was considered as a serious book, whereas the others were simply considered as, I love this word that the English and the American use to describe that, pamphlet. Pamphlet. There, the pamphlet. We don't really know until which number of page, you have to count for a pamphlet to be a pamphlet before becoming a book. But there's this distinction between the two, which is very different. In France, it's different. In Italy, or in Germany, or in Spain, the pamphlets, so to speak, are more maybe admitted. And well, that's the idiosyncrasy, the editorial idiosyncrasy, anyway. But After Law, which is this maybe bigger book, has also the same, let's say, and a bigger book, and a book also which is maybe more important academically speaking for me, because I teach legal theory. That's my field. So I had somehow to prove that I was not completely a fraud in that field, and write something more or less serious about it. So there is this book, of course, called After Law, which is a book where, again, I try to displace one specific category that we have inherited, namely here the category of law, through the recourse to forgotten or a little bit, cast aside types of knowledge. Here, very old historical knowledge about forgotten forms of law, very ancient forms of law, or very foreign, or very forms of law that are very different than the European canon, let's say, of law that has now colonized the entire world, even societies that were during centuries and centuries absolutely foreign to the Western way of thinking about norms and normativity and regulation and so on and so forth. I think, for instance, of China and Japan, who were, let's say, Westernized from the point of view of law at the end of the 19th century through the imposition of types of civil codes modeled upon the German or the French model, in order for them to enter, modernity. So it's After Law is a long trip through different, traditions, forgotten traditions from, ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt up to, Islamic legal thought or rabbinic legal thought, or of course ancient Chinese or Indian or Japanese legal thought, and so on and so forth, in order to unfold or to uncover the lost possibilities that the triumph of Western law had let's say, officialized. And by doing this, what I want also is to show not only that there are possibilities that are worth exploring outside of this canon. For instance, the fact that in rabbinic juridical thinking, it's perfectly possible for a same case with the same facts and, let's say, the same rules to have two different and contradictory solutions. So the idea that the paradox is part of the possibility of a juridical settling is an idea. What if indeed contradiction was something we could reintroduce in the Western legal system as it is not actually functioning? It's or the structure of prophecy in ancient Mesopotamian law, for instance, the fact that indeed there also the relationship between law and reality was a relationship based on the possibility of, let's say, a magical understanding of society, and an understanding of society based on not an ought to be, but some form of inevitability of a consequence happening from something that would then, let's say, reflect upon its origin and in a very almost pragmatist, Jamesian way, confirm the reality of the things that it follows, and etc., etc., etc. because of course I have a problem with Western law, and a problem that's quite hard to describe in English, because if the French have only one word for excitement and excitation, unfortunately English is the only Indo-European language to have only one word for law, whereas all the others have two, namely a word for the description of precisely what I could call the legal, the ensemble of rules, norms, everything that has to be with the ought to be, and then another word for the juridical, something that has nothing to do with law, except of course its contextual relationship, but that constitutes, let's say, the infrastructure of operations, categories, ideas, institutions not in the terms of big institutions, buildings, institutions in the terms of the instituare, so the fact of precisely creating something out of something else. Let's say the contract, for instance, is an institution, or marriage is an institution, or filiation is an institution, and so on and so forth. So all these aspects, these operational aspects of law on the one side, that the French would call droit, the Italian diritto, derecho in Spanish, and so on and so forth. And on the other side, law understood in the ought to be, in the sense of the normative, meaning here, loi in French, or legge, and so on and so forth, Gesetz in German. The distinction is very important because there is a historical reason why there's a difference between the two, that that goes back to ancient Roman times, when the Romans made the distinction between what they call jus for the juridical and lex for the legal. Jus meaning, of course, all these operations that the jurisconsults would invent in order to precisely, and almost also in an almost fictional and hypothetical way, in such a way that they would answer a practical issue with inventions. Whereas the rules, which for the Romans were not very important, were simply about prohibiting something, or allowing something to be done, or forcing something to be done. The very basic deontic, let's say, modalities of the ought to be that we all know. And the distinction between the two, and the fact that at some point in the history of Western law, the lex, the normative, the legal, has come to recover the juridical, the operational, the inventive, let's say, dimension of law, is something like a tragedy, but tragedy that, strangely enough, and especially in France, unfortunately, we seem to be very proud of, as if the rules was all that there was to say about law, as if the ought to be was all that there was to say about this machinery of operations by which we have learned the possibility to build unexpected consequences from a very given situation. Here also I could give an example, or maybe later, because time unfortunately flies very fast. But you understand that here again, my concern is the same. I take this object, law, that seems to be very structured according to some kind of a consensus. We all know what law is, and to say no, we don't know what law is. Actually, law is two different things that are recovered one upon the other, that we have to unlock in order to be able to create some sort of new ways of dealing, let's say, not only with this object, but also with society in general, with what we want to do in I think politically, or even metaphysically with a specific category. So that's what I wanted to do with Afterlord, to try through this travel through different domains and forgotten realms, by unfolding the possibilities still existing and contradicting our ways of dealing with the same problems in other traditions, to force us into looking at our own tradition itself as something which should be revisited, as something that had let a big part or a big chunk of its own reality to be forgotten, and maybe the less desirable of all to be to take the lead. And yes, in order also to if I may say so, to take out of the hands of those who have the capacity or the possibility or the power to say now, according precisely to the determination of the legal, what law is, to give it back to all those who are capable of manipulating the operations, its operations in a way that could, that is not foreseen by rules, that is not framed by laws, that is not determined by normativity, and that could help us invent not only, a better society or whatever, but also very local, efficient solutions. That's why, as François Delmans recalled at the very beginning, the last very small booklet that I've published is about precisely juridical militancy as a way to say, no, the law is not a matter of legislation. It's not a matter of legislator and governors and governments. It's not a matter of even judges. The law, for whatever that means, if we get back to this juridical dimension of law that is forgotten under its legal guise, well, it's the affair of everybody, attorneys, of course, public servants, militants, individuals like you and I, and as it was in the Roman period, of course, the average layman was actually mostly an aristocrat having nothing better to do, but all those who invented all these institutions, the obligation, the marriage, filiation, I said it, the personality, were not lawyers, they were not judges, they were not rulers, they were not governors, they were not governments, they were not in power. They were simply exercising a form of inventiveness that went recognized by their peers and then by those who actually had to manipulate the rules and make them work. But rules never work like that. They need all these machinery of operation to actually work in such a way that if you take them back, if you take them away, there's nothing left actually. There's nothing left from law if you take back all these operations that have this very long history. So yes, these are, after law, narco-capitalism, these are two examples of the things that I do. And that are both about trying to see things differently. I mean, it's a banal thing to say, but really, I really try to. I make lots of efforts for that. I mean, to make even the more banal look eccentric, and to refresh, let's say, our gaze in such a way that even the regime of importance of topics and ideas or institutions can be reshuffled, and that we could again see at things with as they are, namely weird, bizarre, science fiction, ununderstandable, crazy realities. It's crazy. Everything that is out there is absolutely nuts, and I want to recreate something like a form of gaze that, I mean, it's not the old philosophical amazement or sense of wonder. It's absolutely not that. It's more a form of perplexity or suspicion or doubt, but a suspicion that's not a critical suspicion, but a suspicion that there was something there that we have not seen, and with which we could really have fun if we saw it in a different way. So let's say that this is my my way of doing not rocket science but rocket theory, if you like.
Thank you so much, Laurent. This is amazing because, well, your presentation corresponds exactly at what we understand of your way of practicing philosophy. That is very illuminating. So we have already some questions, but I would like to have a short conversation with you, perhaps coming back to this notion of narco-capitalism and anesthesia. We have launched a podcast series on thinking in time of pandemics. And so I would like to know if you think that this particular time is typically a time of anesthesia, or do you think that it allowed to, well, to invent new thoughts, or what do you say? Because I'm I think that, well, I'm here in your I hear in your discourse a desire for, I don't know, excitement, excitation, and perhaps it's your role to, but a desire of perhaps insurrection, to, well, to the kind of will of, you know, provoking the audience to, well, to make the banal excited. So could you say something about yes, the time we are living now, this pandemics, and the role of philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for this question. As the old Mao used to say, we're living interesting times, aren't they? And yeah, I don't know. On another hand, I don't know if I would use the term anesthesia, or to speak about excitations for this, you know, kind of pandemic situation. But there's something that strikes me about the whole pandemic. Again, it's that, again, we have forgotten something, you know, in the along the way. And what we have forgotten is the meaning of epidemic. What is an epidemic? And actually, if we look back again to bizarre forms of knowledge, and bizarre forms and old and ancient forms of knowledge, if we do, for instance, a little bit of philology or a little bit of etymology, when we go back to the epidemic, what we realize is that at the origin, the word epidemic, so in Greek, designated something very specific. And what it designated was the very peculiar moment when, at certain periods, at certain times of the year, traveling gods would visit the city. You know, in ancient Greece, the gods were not located in temples. You know, they would sometimes come and you know, stay for a couple of days in the temple dedicated to them, and then they would simply go away. They would not be, except for some gods, you know, in the chimney or in the kitchen and so on and so forth. Most of the gods were simply traveling gods, and they would pass and they would leave. The problem is that when a god arrives, he or she causes a mess. And it's complicated because they have big powers. So how are we going to deal with these powers? And precisely that was what epidemics were all about. Epidemics were the ceremonies, the sacrifices, even let's say the parties that were launched when a god would come, and it was necessary to, you know, appease and to deal with said god in order to benefit from what there was to be benefited from, and to avoid any danger, any problematic form of coexistence during the moment when the god would be there. And between humans and the god, there would be a moment when, you know, yeah, we'll have to live with that. So the epidemic was a way to acknowledge, let's say, the coexistence with forces much stronger than ourselves that would pass by and that could destroy us or in some way benefit us. And I've been fascinated with the fact that the pandemic, in the kind of immunologist or immunological paradigm that is the one of our societies, that this dimension has been not even discussed, or maybe by one or two people, but that the dominant reflex was the, you know, immunological reflex, to speak like Derrida or like Peter Sloterdijk, you know. And I think that the Greeks, you know, the meditation upon this idea of a dispositive, because this was a dispositive, you know, the epidemic was a dispositive, it was a system allowing for a form of coexistence that could be positive, is something which is important. It's even more important than what defines, of course, our pandemical condition, is precisely that we have equipped the world with systems of coexistence with other beings that are very ill-conceived. We know that the virus has traveled as we travel. I mean, the virus has taken the train, he has taken the plane, he has jumped on board boats, he has used all the means, let's say the infrastructure or the logistical means of transportation that we have built to equip the planet in such a way that our life, let's say, could be improved or made, more or less efficient for very good or very bad reasons. That's a completely different debate. But this kind of logistical or infrastructural equipment, let's say, of the planet is both what has allowed our flourishing, again, for good or for bad, but also the flourishing of the virus, because we have not thought of this dispositive as precisely a dispositive of coexistence with other forces than ours. So if I may say something about the pandemic, everybody has talked a lot about it. If I may say something about the pandemic, it's these two things. First, think about it in terms, not in terms of immunology, of things that we have to protect against, but on the contrary, something we have to coexist with. And second, all the more because of the fact that it's the world as we have made it is the world where the coexistence with this virus is a forced coexistence, because if we take back what allows the existence of the virus, namely this infrastructure, well, we also take back what allows our existence to be possible. So there is some kind of a double, there's a deadlock on one hand, and the necessity to think about this deadlock in another way on the other, that I find huge, meaning that we have to rethink what is a world, and what is about living in a world, and who we are living in a world with, or what we are living with, or what compose, let's say, the ecology that we have made, it's almost materially, from a material perspective, or for an infrastructural perspective. So that I don't have a conclusion about that. I mean, it's just two observations, but that's what I would.
Yeah. But coming back to your reference to Greek god and goddesses, so would you say that the sacrifices would be more a sacrifice of freedom to appease them, to appease the epidemic?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know what kind of sacrifice it would be. I think rather than seeing it as a temporary burden, I think it's at a more general level that we have to think about that, because it's one pandemic. It's not the pandemic. It's one. It will most probably will be followed by others, and so on and so forth. So it's the entire system of the possibility of coexistence that has to be rethought, and not simply one very specific case where the coexistence was fucked up. So it's really about rethinking the world, as people have discussed a lot about the world that would come, and the world of the world that would come after, and so on and so forth. It was not that stupid to say so, because it's indeed at the level of the world that things have to be thought, and at the level of what equips the world, what makes the world a world through this infrastructure equipment, rather than from the point of view of the individuals, especially since this disease is absolutely horrible in the unpredictability with which it acts and kills some people and avoid others, and then metabolizes and transforms itself into still something different, and puzzles the doctors and the epidemiologists and everyone. So I would not have nothing to say, to be fair, on our moral or ethical or even political situation in respect to the pandemic, because I very seldom use the categories of freedom or responsibility. The moral categories are very foreign to my work. I don't know what to do with them. I'm afraid of these categories, because I don't know. I have the impression that they cause misunderstanding at the moment they start to appear. So I'm very much afraid of them. But yes, I would say that the problem is cosmological rather than ethical or even political.
Okay. Thank you, Laurent. There are several questions coming from Yanis Tsiligakis. First one, quite often, people try to have courts decide the veracity or historical truth. Are courts equipped to adjudicate truth? Can a court decision decide what truth is, regardless if courts are capable of proving truth? Do courts have a duty to society to examine such cases? I'm referring to cases of international law, assessments of reparations, etc.
Oh, that's a nice one and a tough one too. Honestly, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know what to answer to that, because you know, again, I mean, it's an easy answer, and I'm sorry for that, truly. Yeah. But I don't deal with issues of decision and courts and truth, because I wouldn't say that it doesn't matter or that it's not important. I suppose it is. But I would say that it's not important for me, or it's not important for what I'm trying to do, whether courts decide for truth or not. What I'm interested in is what we can do with what they decide, whether it's true or what is not true, whether it's about truth or whether it's not about truth, and how what is decided can affect or not our possibility of using this or that legal operation, not legal, juridical operation in this or that direction. So it's always about possibilities and impossibilities rather than truth or untruth. It's about what it allows and what it renders impossible. And what I'm trying to do in every case, and I'm sorry if this answer disappoints you a lot, it's not my goal. I don't do that for disappointing you, but what I'm really interested in is that, and is to look from the point of view of the forgotten possibilities in a society where the impossibility is definitely organized, and especially at the level of course, where unfortunately most judges don't realize that they still have the capacity of invention and not simply of being the guardian of a certain state of norms. So yeah, sorry for that.
Okay. There's just, another question. I would like to do a comparative exposition between the American system and the European countries, and the role of courts as that may be different because of the difference in the respective constitutions. In the US, courts have only jurisdiction over the sovereign citizen only if there is a harmed party involved. That makes most of the American court system a commercial one. In Europe, though, courts have jurisdiction over the sovereign. Is my comparison correct?
Well, it's a nice one. I'd love it to be correct, but I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you too, because I don't think that there's the slightest difference between the American or the US and the UK legal system and the civil and the continental legal system. There's no difference whatsoever. This is a very strong belief of mine. There's no difference whatsoever between common law and civil law. I don't know why people still insist on that difference, as if these were two worlds apart. Actually, it's exactly the same, especially now, especially to this day. In the 15th century, maybe the civil law was, the continental Europe was already a little bit, was already orienting itself towards, domination of the legal, whereas the first, forms, very primitive forms of English law were still conserving and trying to to maintain alive a few very old Roman intuitions, but I would say that now the triumph of the legal is general, and then the triumph, of course, of the structure of power that supports the domination of the legal over the juridical is more or less the same wherever we look. I mean, whether it depends on the question of the sovereign and sovereignty, whether it depends on the question of the constitution, or whether even it depends on economical questions or merely political questions. So either the institutional structure and design, the constitutional design, and so on and so forth, or the political and economical circumstances now are one and only. Of course, there are nuances, and you're very right in making differences from the point of view of nuances. But the question that I would ask in return would be, do we really need nuances at this time, or do we need something more absurdly clear-cut, more distinction that would be more radical than nuances? Except, of course, if the nuances that you point out produce consequences that exceed their own limits, and in that case, I would of course I would love to follow you on the distinction that you make. But for the moment, I think that at least strategically, it's important to consider all the different nuances within the Western legal world as pointless with regards to the true type of differences that we need to look for, which okay, I suggest one, okay, the juridical and the legal, but there are plenty others from the point of view, I don't know, of the question of legal certainty, for instance, that Francois also mentioned earlier on. Is it true that law has something to do with legal certainty? Why do we need legal certainty? Is it so? Is it really an important question or an important issue that law would be or should be there to protect? What does that mean? Society, what does that mean? From falling into chaos, what does that mean? I ask the question. And I feel, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I feel that this is the direction that is the most urgent for the moment, rather than the one you suggest. Now, maybe it's very arrogant to say that, and so I'm sorry for that.
Okay. Laurent, coming back to your books and the fact that you like to write small books, or so-called pamphlet here, but and also the fact that you consider that thinking is a kind of act, gesture, provocation for thinking. Does it have something to do with pop philosophy? And would you say that you are a pop philosopher?
Oh, I don't know. I would take that as a title of honor if I was considered like that. But it's true that it's a concept that I love and I'm very interested in. It's also because it's a misunderstood concept, and a concept that appears in the work of Gilles Deleuze, because Gilles Deleuze was the one who invented the concept of pop philosophy. Appears only 2 or 3 times, and in very strange moments in his work, and like that, and then vanishes. So it's a concept that has never been formally installed and fully staged as a concept in Deleuze. And these are, of course, the concept that I do prefer, because it has not been completely staged. It has not first been over-interpreted, and the meaning has not been completely closed. So I can use it and do something with it. But it's true that in the few remarks that Deleuze has given about the concept of pop philosophy, he has said very fascinating things about precisely the question of reading. For him, pop philosophy was about a way of reading the world, reading philosophy first, but also reading the world, that he would equate with the idea of the electricity, the idea that something passes through, like in a pop concert, you would say, or like when watching television or listening to radio. So this idea of the electricity of thought, but the idea also that thought has something to do with piracy, for instance, is something that I'm very interested in. The idea of when Deleuze writes pop philosophy, writes pop with some kind of a dash, how do you say that, a um, like in metaphysics, there's this little thing before the first letter. It's in French would say an apostrophe. I don't know how you say that in English, but you would write it like that, like if there was something inside of the word that had been put to avoid the word would close its meaning upon itself and stay half cracked. And with the pop, of course, which is the pop also of pop and pop culture, the pop that is the box that does pop, the box that pops, and that opens up to something that was not in the box, or that renders impossible the closing of the box. This is indeed something that I'm very interested in, and I love this concept, and I don't mind being called pop philosopher, despite the fact that, but that's between you and me. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a lawyer, which is I dare to say, which is almost a shame in this very prestigious assembly. So yeah, pop philosophy. I like it.
Well, you are a philosopher of law, and but I would like to ask something about your role as an editor. You edit authors as different as such as Zizek or Clément Rosset. Do you follow a philosophical line in your series?
Oh yeah, both for the theory redux series or the perspective critique series. Yeah, I definitely follow a line which is both openly a generational line. I mean, I know that this concept is crap, and that generation, what does that mean? I know it, but still there's something like feelings or affinities, and I can't help but work with these affinities, and these affinities goes to some masters or big figures that were important and that are important for me and for people maybe my age or maybe my sensibility, or and I try to publish the two at the same time. So those figures, indeed, there was Zizek and Jacques Rancière and Alain Badiou. For the French series, in English, I've published, Franco Berardi, I've published Roberto Esposito, people like that. But also those with whom I want to dialogue. I want to dialogue because they also try to break the black box of thinking in their own respective place, or in their own respective style, or in their own respective field. So when I publish, Nick Cernik or Helen Hester with Theory Redux, that's what I have in mind. Or when I publish, I don't know, Marc Alizard, for instance, in Perspective Critique, or people like Paco Mtielmo, unfortunately not translated into English. It's that, of course, that I also have in mind. Or Marion Zilio, who is translated into English. That's also figures that share, I think, something which is utterly non-academic. I admit that. I very seldom publish people from the academic world. I mean, formally academic. Simply because I can't stand their writing style. That's basically that, These books that come with this introduction and then the chapters and then I can't stand it, because for me there's the necessity for the books themselves because they're laboratories, to formally express the type of thought that they're trying to unfold. So I want, if you have an intense way of thinking, the book has to be intense. If you have a confrontational way of thinking, the book has to be confrontation, and so on and so forth. And the form has to accompany this, to come with it, and to avoid also to avoid this pitfall of most academic books, which is you read the intro and you know everything. I don't want that from the books. I want that you start, you know where you are when you start, but you're obliged to read through until the end to finally have the solution, like in a mystery novel, or like in a thriller. There's this idea, which was also an idea of, that Deleuze was very fond of, the idea of, the philosophy as roman noir, as a noir novel or as science fiction. So there is as there is a suspense in life, I want thought to express the same kind of suspense, and books also, and show the type of work, show thinking at work, and the surprise of the discovery of thinking at work. And this is something that I love with people like Zizek, for instance, that I love with people like Helen Hester or others. And these are the people that I want to, that I want to publish. And eventually, if they become academic, that's not the issue. I mean, I'm not against academia. I simply refuse all the projects that I get from academia because they simply don't fit with the type of form that I'm looking for, the type of language that I'm looking for, the type of intensity and electricity that I'm looking for, and also the type of radicality. But a type of radicality, you know, it's a radicality which is half play, half stand up almost. You know, it's almost theater and half serious. And this is also something which, matters to me. The issues are serious, but the means may be the means of comedy, and this is something that had been too much forgotten from the history of thought, and I seek to help.
Sure. Last and perhaps more general question, Laurent. Could you tell us, because you read many books, manuscripts, and could you tell us what, in your opinion, has changed in philosophy? I mean, its contents and its practices in the 21st century?
Well, of course, it all depends on where the region where you speak, the region of which you speak, because everything has shifted, and to me, we're living really very different times from the moment when I was at the university and I was reading Derrida and I was reading Bourdieu and Barthes and Lacan and all those. I was not supposed to read them because in law school you don't, it was considered subversive, so you would not read those. It was not kosher, but from this moment when there was all these big figures, and then of course Badiou and Rancière and Bruno Latour and people like that, or in the Anglo-Saxon world, Frederick Jameson, David Harvey, all those, Judith Butler, and now there's a shift, and the shift for me is a thematic shift first. Of course, there's the rise of questions pertaining to the environment, the shifts in the post-colonial and decolonial discourse, of also the shift in the kind of post-queer and new feminism and so on and so forth. So from the point of view of topics, of course, it has changed because the world has changed and the urgency has changed, but it has also changed from the point of view of form. And maybe that Slavoj Žižek has played an underestimated role in that. Slavoj Žižek and Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher for me is somebody very important. And unfortunately in France, it's a catastrophe that no one knows who he is, because he has, in the Anglo-Saxon world, especially the English world, he has had a huge influence also in reinventing the canon of writing style. The philosophical or the theoretical writing style at the beginning of the 20th century was what? It was very verbose, very post-Derrida, people were really, building sentences that were nice and convoluted and researched. And sometimes they would indeed go very far and say absolutely brilliant and important things, but often also it would turn, into some kind of a snake eating its tail, some kind of round circle. And with Žižek and with Fisher, there's this new clarity in language and the necessity to go fast and say what things are as fast as possible and as counterfactual as possible. Also, why not? And so, from the point of view of style and the relationship with writing, I think that there is a huge shift that I've seen, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, but also in France and in the French-speaking world. And there has been a growing distancing from these, very intimidating masters, and we have come to realize that, well, nobody's perfect, and that maybe it's high time to acknowledge that there are new ways to be explored, for which these masters were actually part of the problem. And one of the biggest examples is, of course, the question of critique and of critical thinking. And maybe it's something that came through Deleuze and that came through Latour, but I think that we are, at the first steps of a very important turn in thinking, which would be a post-critical thinking, meaning confronted to the pitfalls of critical thinking, the fact that critical thinking now has become its own worst enemy, because critical thinking is, a flat earther is critical. There cannot be, anybody more critical than somebody believing that the earth is flat, or all those who spread and believe in conspiracy theories. Actually, they're exerting critical thinking up to the point where critical thinking reverses into its opposite and shows its dark side, and shows by showing its dark side that actually there was a bug in the program from the onset, and now we see what the bug is. And so there's a huge work to be done now, and that has to be somehow formulated and formalized about what to do when critical thinking is it's not working anymore. It's not working anymore. What can we do to recreate the possibility of forms of thought that could be creative and productive, without falling back on the old idea of critique, and then of the superiority of the one who critiques upon what is critiqued. That's one of the big challenges, and I think that there's a whole generation of people, from Tristan Garcia to Marc Alizard that I've mentioned earlier, to others in France, but not only in France. Armen Avanesian in Germany, Srećko Horvat in Croatia, many people, Simone Rigatoni or Emanuele Ciccia in Italy, and so on and so forth. So there are many people now who are starting to realize that this is going to be the next big challenge.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Laurent. That was amazing. Very, very fascinating what you say about this turn in philosophy in the 21st century. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon in presence, in person, at La Maison Française.
I'd love it, François. Thank you so much for having me.
See you soon.